Key legal issues to be aware of. My name is Nadine Clode, and I'm joined by my colleague Amy Williams to present today's session, which will run for about 45 minutes or so. We are both lawyers in Justice Connect's not-for-profit law service, which I'll introduce in a moment. This webinar is being recorded in Melbourne, so we would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are recording from, the Kulin Nations, and pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. We would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from all parts of the country you are listening in from. Before we get started, we want to make clear why this is an important topic and why it is important that you listen in if you are a youth volunteer involving organisation, or are you thinking about involving young volunteers in your organisation. By youth, we mean people under the age of 18. In summary, all of your legal obligations to your volunteers extend to your young volunteers. You will, however, have additional obligations for volunteers under the age of 18. In this webinar, we will not cover all of those legal issues that you need to consider when managing volunteers. We do provide a full day training on this topic, but we are going to focus today on some of the key things you should be aware of when engaging, managing, and protecting young people as volunteers. One final note, our focus as lawyers is to talk about the legal issues when managing your youth volunteers. It is important to acknowledge that this is just one part of the picture when working with volunteers. Volunteering peaks, such as Volunteering Australia, and the state-based volunteering peaks play a crucial role in the volunteering space and provide a range of extremely useful resources for volunteers and volunteer-involving organisations, including best practice, to help fill out the rest of the volunteering picture. So let's get started. For those of you who do not know much about Justice Connect or who are using our service for the first time today, we are a community legal centre with a range of services that you can see here on the screen. The not-for-profit law service is circled in red. Justice Connect is a not-for-profit organisation, and we are a registered charity. Like your organisation, we also engage volunteers, employees, and at other times, other types of workers. At Not-for-Profit Law, we provide a number of services to not-for-profit organisations. To access this webinar, you would have come through our Not-for-Profit Law website, specifically the People Involved tile on the screen. This webinar is one of hundreds of freely available resources available on this site. On the screen, you will see other tiles with topics such as running the organisation or important agreements. Behind each of these tiles are fact sheets, guides, template checklists, and videos, providing legal information on a variety of topics relevant to not-for-profit organisations. On the topic of volunteers, you may also be interested in our new National Volunteer Guide and our other free webinars, The Volunteering Relationship and Unpaid Workers. In addition to these resources, at Not-for-Profit Law, we also provide training. We run low-cost webinars, different to the one we're running today. They're longer and you can ask questions and have a live answer given to you. We also run customised in-house training for not-for-profits, local councils and peak bodies that want to engage us for something a bit more targeted to their circumstances. We also have a free telephone advice service for eligible not-for-profits who haven't been able to find the answers to their questions elsewhere. Throughout this webinar, we will mention at times that you might need further legal advice on a specific matter. If your organisation meets our eligibility criteria, we may be able to assist you on a pro bono basis. So click on this page on the website. Finally, we do a lot of law reform work and advocate to cut red tape across the sector. Today, we're going to cover 4 different things. What is different about youth volunteers? That is, why it's particularly important to distinguish youth volunteers from other types of workers. We're also going to talk about engaging youth volunteers, managing them and protecting them. And just an important point to note, the content of today's webinar is legal information, not legal advice. Now, Amy.
So what is different about youth volunteers? To demonstrate why it is important to distinguish youth volunteers from other types of volunteers, today we will be using 3 case studies that highlight some important issues when engaging youth volunteers. We will be addressing these issues as we move through the webinar. So on the screen there we have case study number 1. Mountain Creek Youth Inc. is a youth organisation which holds a range of events for young people in its local area. Jessica is 16 years old and a member. The committee of Mountain Creek Youth Inc. decides it is time to revamp their office. They want to be able to hold more events at the centre, and they want the local young people to feel like the space belongs to them. A call goes out to members to assist in the revamp working bee on the weekend, and Jessica is keen to assist. She wants to paint a mural on one of the walls. Jessica mounts a ladder and unfortunately slips whilst climbing it to paint the wall. She injures her back. In this scenario, it's important to ask, is Jessica a member or a volunteer, and what's the difference? Did Mountain Creek Youth Inc. have parental consent for Jessica to volunteer? Is Mountain Creek Youth Inc. liable for Jessica's injury? Did they breach their duty of care? And does Mountain Creek Youth Inc.'s insurance cover Jessica? She is a volunteer and under 18 years of age. Now onto the second scenario. Back to the same organisation, Mountain Creek Youth Inc. Georgina is 17 years old and a member. Mountain Creek Youth Inc. is organising a dance party on Friday night for under 14-year-olds. It has asked some of the older youth members, such as Georgina, as well as some of the parents, to help out on the night. Georgina volunteers her time. She is on the late shift. Her job is to help everyone out of the dance hall and clean up after the party along with some of the parents. Along with all the adults, Georgina finishes at 11 p.m. and isn't quite sure how she's getting home. There is no public transport and she doesn't have a car or enough money to get a taxi. This scenario raises some important questions. Does Mountain Creek Youth Inc. have an obligation to make sure Georgina gets home safely? Is this different to their obligations towards the adult volunteers? Do the adult volunteers volunteering with Georgina need to have working with children check clearances? Does Mountain Creek Youth Inc. need to get a working with children check on Georgina to work with under 14-year-olds? And does Mountain Creek Youth Inc.'s insurance cover late night volunteering? Now on to Raj. Raj is 16 years old and a member. Raj manages the Mountain Creek Youth Inc. Facebook page. Raj gets into an argument with the volunteer manager at Mountain Creek Youth Inc. Raj decides that he, along with all his friends, will post an embarrassing photo of the volunteer manager on the Mountain Creek Youth Inc. Facebook page and then get all of his friends to unfriend the volunteer manager. This scenario raises the important question, does Mountain Creek Youth Inc. have any legal obligations here? Now let's start to answer some of these questions. Those scenarios may have gotten you thinking about some of the particular characteristics of youth volunteers. Here are a few factors on the screen you should consider when you are looking at legal issues in engaging and managing youth volunteers. So, skills and experience. Remember that young people are still developing their skills and may have different competencies and physical capabilities from adult volunteers. Consider this when you are thinking about allocating roles, providing instruction and supervision, and looking out for the safety of your youth volunteers and those they are engaging with. Your youth volunteers are likely to have little experience in workplaces and may not be aware of their rights, for example, to a safe workplace, or their responsibility, for example, they may be unfamiliar with appropriate workplace behaviours or work health and safety. It is important to think carefully about the way you induct, train, and supervise your youth volunteers to make sure they understand their rights and obligations. In some areas, young people can lack confidence and may not feel comfortable asking questions or seeking help. Creating an environment where your youth volunteers can speak out and let you know if they have a concern is very important. On the other hand, in some areas, young people might be overly confident about their skills and may be less aware of appropriate boundaries. This means you need to be particularly clear when you set up and supervise boundaries for your youth volunteers. It is particularly important because in some circumstances, if a volunteer is acting outside of their role and causes harm, your organisation and the volunteer could be legally responsible. Finally, children and young people are considered to be at a greater risk than other members of the community in certain areas. As we will see, there may be specific laws that apply to the protection of children and young people that you need to consider when you engage youth volunteers. In the next sections, we will look at these considerations through a legal lens.
Thanks, Amy. Let's now turn to engaging youth volunteers in the workplace. In terms of engaging youth volunteers, we're going to focus on two things today. The first, the factors to consider when engaging youth volunteers as board members. Is it allowed, and what are the key considerations? Other kinds of young unpaid workers, such as work for the dole, court-ordered volunteering, internships. Is it allowed, and what are the key considerations? And secondly, the difference between youth volunteers and members of an organisation. So now we turn to distinguishing between youth volunteers and youth board members, or board members, often called committee members. First, it is important to set out whether or not you can have people under the age of 18 as a committee member. It will depend often on the legal structure of your organisation and your rules or constitution. The table on the screen sets out any age restrictions relevant to incorporated association laws in each state and territory and the Corporations Act for CLGs, or Companies Limited by Guarantee. If you're not sure what legal structure your organisation is, a good place to start is the Australian Business Register. You can do a search there at www.abn.gov.au. You'll need the name of the organisation, and if you know the ABN, it's a good idea to have one. The register will then state, if you're an incorporated association or even a cooperative, that it will list or it will be listed as an other incorporated entity. You will then need to search your state and territory regulator of not-for-profits to confirm your structure. If your company is a company limited by guarantee, it will be indicated on the register as an Australian public company. The register will also show generally whether your organisation is a charity. You can then go to the charity register, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, and that acnc.gov.au, and once there you'll be able to find a copy of the rules of your organisation. There may also be someone in your organisation that can provide the rules, often called constitution, and you really should do this anyway, as the rules may have requirements relating to your organisation's board and how it operates. Now to turn to the legal requirements in a bit more detail. On the table on the screen, you'll see a heading, the law. The law in some jurisdictions specifies a minimum age for committee and or board members. This means that your constitution or rules must reflect this age limit. The law in some jurisdictions also specifies that the secretary or the public officer must be at least 18 years of age. Depending on which legal structure you have and which state or territory you are operating in, the secretary or public officer doesn't necessarily need to be a board or committee member. And this person has a variety of duties generally, such as notifying the regulator of certain changes to your organisation, lodging certain documents, and keeping certain records. Remember that age isn't the only restriction that the law can place on who or who cannot be a committee member. The law can also add additional restrictions, such as where the person lives or their personal history. We're only covering age here today. On the table, on the screen, you will also see a heading Model Rules. If you're an incorporated association, you may have what is called the Model Rules, or your own set of rules. Most state and territory regulators have developed what is called the Model Rules. These are template rules developed by the regulator that an association can choose to adopt instead of making their own rules. Remember, you will not have the Model Rules if you've changed or modified the Model Rules. In effect, you will have your own set of rules. As you will see from the table on the screen, there are some age restrictions found in these model rules or constitutions, depending on which state or territory you're in. These age restrictions may be relevant in deciding whether your organisation wants to adopt the model rules in part or in full. If you have modified your rules, make sure you check them to see that you've drafted in any age restrictions. If you're a company limited by guarantee, you may have your own rules, or what's called the replaceable rules in the Corporations Act, or a combination of the two. If you're a company limited by guarantee that is also a registered charity with the ACNC, you may have adopted the ACNC template constitution. As you will see from the screen, the ACNC template constitution for CLGs is silent on the age restriction. But remember, there are minimum age restrictions for CLGs under the law, in that the person must be 18. Engaging youth volunteers. On the screen, you will see a spectrum of working relationships that not-for-profit organisations can engage in. Another way that young people may engage with your organisation is through mutual obligation activities, court-ordered volunteering, and what we will call unpaid work. The reason this is important to distinguish is that there are key differences between these categories of workers and the nature of the relationship or relationships that exist, which also will have differing legal obligations for your organisation. We have another freely available webinar available on the topic of unpaid workers that explores this type of volunteering in greater detail and compares to it to more traditional volunteering. You can find this webinar on the volunteers page next to where you found this one. Finally, we're just going to talk about youth volunteer versus a youth member. It is very important to note, or to be aware, that members of your organisation may also be considered volunteers in particular circumstances. As soon as an organisation asks a member to do something outside of his or her role as a member, the person may be considered a volunteer as well as a member, which has certain legal implications. A member of a not-for-profit organisation is a formal legal status. Members have certain rights and obligations which will be outlined under the organisation's rules or constitution. It's another good reason to make sure you have a copy. For example, the right to vote at an AGM, attend meetings and access information, as well as any of those set out under the legislation. This is because the Constitution is a form of contract between it or the organisation and its members. This is important from a legal point of view because certain laws apply to volunteers that may not apply to members, and insurance may apply to volunteers and members in a different way. Let's go back to our case study from the start of the webinar. As you may recall, Jessica is a member of her local youth organisation, the Mountain Creek Youth Incorporated. The group organises a range of events for young people in the area. The committee decide that it is time to revamp their office. They want to be able to hold more events at the centre. A call goes out to members to assist in the revamp working bee, and Jessica is keen to assist, so she volunteers. She wants to paint a mural on one of the walls. Unfortunately, she slips and injures her back. Mountain Creek Youth Inc.'s public liability insurance policy does not cover injuries to volunteers. As she's not an employee, Jessica does not have access to workers' compensation insurance. Mountain Creek does not have insurance that covers volunteers, and therefore Jessica has no access to insurance to cover the costs associated with her injuries sustained while claiming the latter and volunteering. The point is to be really clear about when someone is performing the role as a volunteer or a member. Beware of this overlap.
Thanks, Nadine. We'll now turn to the management of youth volunteers. In this section, we will cover some of the key considerations in managing and administering youth volunteer involvement. Setting up the volunteer relationship. What do you need to do to properly set up the relationship between your organisation and a youth volunteer? Minimum working conditions, such as the minimum age of employment and types of work that a young person can undertake. And finally, insurance, some things to look out for when insuring your youth volunteers. Setting up the volunteer relationship. There are some things that we recommend you do to properly help set up the relationship between your organisation and a youth volunteer. By this, we mean not only ensuring you meet your legal obligations towards your volunteer, but other matters which we consider to be good practice. You may also wish to consider Volunteering Australia's national standards for volunteer involvement here, because there are also some particularly relevant standards that help you engage, manage and protect your volunteers to help your organisation achieve the goals whilst also providing a meaningful contribution of their time and skills. So the law recognises many categories of worker, paid or unpaid, volunteers, employees, independent contractors, and other types of unpaid work like student placement and internships. The rights and obligations of one type of worker are different to rights and obligations of another type of worker, and it can be risky and costly to classify someone as the incorrect category of worker. You should refer to our freely available webinar, the volunteering relationship, for more information. Now, one way to make it clear to both parties that you intend to enter into a volunteer relationship and not an employment relationship, for example, is to have a volunteer agreement between you and the organisation. The volunteer agreement would explain that the arrangement is a volunteer relationship and not, for example, an employment relationship, to avoid confusion. It would also set out the obligations of both the volunteer and the organisation so that everyone is clear. Just a note to say that a volunteer agreement is not the only way to ensure that you have a volunteer relationship rather than an employment or independent contractor relationship. And more information about these risks and what a volunteer agreement is can be found in Chapter 2 and 5 of our National Guide, along with a sample volunteering agreement. Now onto a role description. A role description explains to a volunteer the parameters of their role, the tasks they will be asked to perform, who their supervisor is, and their duties and responsibilities. This is useful for a number of reasons. It clearly communicates to the young person what is and isn't expected of them and who to go to if they have a problem. A role description can help your organisation analyse whether a young person has adequate skills and experience to perform the role. For example, does the role call for skills or experience that a young person might not have yet gained? In which case, you should consider if the young person is right for the role. Or do you need to put in place extra safeguards, such as supervision, to ensure they can safely perform the role? Or are there things that you need to do, like training, to help them better carry out the role? If you are having issues with your youth volunteer acting outside the boundaries of their role, this document can help you in guiding them back to their agreed duties. In certain circumstances, your organisation could be held liable, that is, legally responsible, for the actions of your volunteers. For example, where they have injured or harmed another person. Generally, this will not be the case if the volunteer is acting outside the scope of the work organised by the organisation or contrary to any instructions given by the organisation in relation to the provision of the service. A role description is not the only way that you can protect yourself from liability or create a safe working environment. For more information about these risks, see Part 3 of our National Guide and Part 5 for more information about role descriptions. Induction. This is a best risk management practice that will help you fulfill your legal obligations to the volunteer. Again, this is a process you should go through with all of your volunteers, but with youth volunteers, you may need to take some extra time to explain policies and make sure they understand them. Make sure your volunteer understands all of your organisational policies and why they exist, highlighting particularly relevant policies to your youth volunteers. For example, your social media policy, your privacy policy, IT policy, and appropriate workplace behaviour. And maybe even your complaints policy. So if, for example, the volunteer or their parent or guardian has a complaint, they know what to do. Explain the importance of a safe workplace and provide training on how to avoid harmful situations where possible and any special safety requirements. Foster a culture of open communication by encouraging the volunteer to ask questions or express any concerns regarding the role at any time. Allocate a trusted buddy and or mentor to the volunteer. Understand the youth volunteer's study requirements and term dates to ensure volunteering does not interfere with this, and ensure you have the details of the youth volunteer's emergency contacts and important health information, for example, allergies or medical conditions. You may be interested in our volunteer induction checklist, which is also part of our National Guide. Supervision. You may have a higher standard of duty of care when it comes to young people. Making sure that you have adequate and appropriate supervision in place can be one way to ensure that you meet this requirement. This is particularly important when, for example, your youth volunteers are undertaking riskier activities, volunteering at night or on a third party's premises. Parental consent. Some states and territories have minimum age restrictions for employing young people, and in some instances, this includes volunteering. Some specifically require parental consent. Your organisation may wish to consider whether parental consent is required or is a good way for your organisation to manage risk. We'll discuss this a bit later on as well in more detail. And finally, insurance. We will discuss insurance a bit later on in this webinar as well, but it is also important to ask yourself before you engage a volunteer whether or not you have an insurance policy to cover them. Each state and territory has a set of laws that govern the employment of young people. Whilst the laws differ in each jurisdiction, very often there is a minimum age requirement restrictions on what a young person can and cannot do, restrictions on when they can work, and sometimes a requirement for parental or guardian consent. The reason we are mentioning it here is because whilst in most cases these laws apply to strict employment scenarios, that is where a contract of employment exists or when work is undertaken in exchange for payment, in some states and territories, these laws may extend to unpaid working or volunteering. Whilst these laws most often govern strict employment scenarios as opposed to volunteering, it is also, in our view, a matter of best practice to meet these requirements. These policies and procedures should cover off on things like the age of the volunteer, the maximum hours of volunteering per week, interference with school hours, supervision requirements, consent, minimum breaks and maximum shift length, and the nature of the work. You should become familiar with the laws relating to minimum working conditions for children in your jurisdiction, whether or not they apply specifically to volunteering. It is also important to note that the legislation governing the employment of young people very often makes exceptions for traineeships and apprenticeships, as well as other kind of works, for example, donations or collections. On the screen here, you will see a reference to the main pieces of legislation or law governing working conditions for young people. These laws often set requirements around the working conditions of young people. For example, some states and territories explicitly ban volunteering during school hours, and some of the laws set out the type of work a young person can do. Whilst many of these laws apply to the employment of young people and not necessarily young people volunteering, it would be considered best practice to follow them when engaging young people as volunteers. Please know that in some cases there are regulations and there may be additional laws, for example, legislation about the education of young people in a particular state that govern this area. If you are not sure about conditions for engaging youth volunteers, you may need to seek legal advice. There are also some specific considerations you will need to take into account when considering insurance for your youth volunteers. We cover off on workers' compensation and public liability insurance in greater detail in our other freely available webinar, The Volunteering Relationship, but for the purposes of this webinar, generally, volunteers are not entitled to workers' compensation and public liability insurance, will usually only cover injuries a volunteer causes to others, but may not cover injuries caused to volunteers themselves. Now, this is why many volunteer involving organisations take out volunteer personal accident insurance. You can see that highlighted in pink on the screen. Volunteer personal accident insurance will cover members and volunteers of a community organisation for expenses incurred in the event of an accidental injury, disability or death which occurs whilst the volunteer is doing the work for the community organisation. So if we go back to our case study where Jessica falls off the ladder and hurts her back, and the client, Mountain Creek Youth Inc. would want to know about their insurance policies covered the actions of Jessica, that is, they covered any cost arising out of the harm caused to the client. They'd want to know that it covers Jessica's injuries as a volunteer, and they'd also want to know that it covers Jessica's age group, because sometimes insurance policies only cover certain age groups. Another really important question to ask if you're engaging youth volunteers is whether the type of work they are undertaking with you is covered. For example, does your insurance policy cover work placements or student placements? Or is this insurance covered by a particular educational facility, for example? Now I'm going to pass back on to Nadine.
Thanks, Amy. We're now going to talk about protecting your volunteers. So in this section, we're going to talk about safety, protecting youth volunteers and the people that your youth volunteers engage with, mandatory reporting, that is your legal obligation to report if you know or suspect that a child is at risk of harm or an offence has taken place. Each state and territory in Australia has a slightly different regime. And screening checks. That is your legal obligation to screen employees and/or volunteers because they are working with children. First to the safety. We want to talk about safety of youth volunteers because in addition to your duty of care, your community organisation owes to its employees, clients, and possibly members of the public, you will need to consider the special responsibilities you may have in relation to children and young people that your organisation comes into contact with when providing services. You have a legal responsibility to ensure their physical, mental, and emotional safety. The laws around safety differ in every state and territory, and we're only providing a high-level overview of the general principles today. The first concept is that there are primarily two sources of law. As for all other people involved in your organisation or affected by its activities, you owe your youth volunteers a duty of care. The duty comes from the common law of negligence, which applies to all community organisations. Work, occupational, health and safety laws may also apply to your organisation. The second concept, the two sides to safety. There are two sides to safety, the safety of the volunteer themselves and the safety of the people the volunteer is interacting with. So that is the legal responsibility for the actions of the volunteer and the legal responsibility to the volunteer. The legal responsibility owed to the volunteer is usually what people think of first when we talk about safety. Organisations owe their volunteers a duty of care, and even if the volunteer is injured in the course of their duties, the organisation may be liable if it hasn't taken reasonable care. However, equally as important and sometimes less obvious is the safety of the people that your volunteer interacts with. That is, your duty for the actions of the volunteer whilst volunteering with you. We know that volunteers interact with a variety of people when they volunteer, whether that be other volunteers, employees and contractors, clients, or members of the public. If a volunteer causes injury to another person during the course of performing their role for your organisation may be liable for the actions of that volunteer. This means it's really important to make sure your youth volunteers understand they need to act safely according to instructions and under supervision. We might turn to scenario 3 here, Raj, and his behaviour towards the volunteer manager at Mountain Creek Youth Incorporated, when he decides he and his friends will post an embarrassing photo of the volunteer manager on the organisation's Facebook page. And then he and all his friends will get their friends to unfriend the volunteer manager. This is possibly bullying behaviour. Bullying is prohibited under both work health and safety laws and negligence law, as well as the Fair Work Act. Work health and safety laws. If your organisation is covered by your state or territory's health and safety laws, your organisation's volunteers will be protected. Negligence. As we've just said, all community organisations have a legal duty to take responsible care of volunteers and the people that their volunteers are interacting with, including psychiatric injuries such as depression and anxiety caused by bullying behaviour. We're not going to talk about this in any more detail here, but we strongly encourage you to read Chapter 3 of the National Guide, which explains this further. On our website, we also have a section dedicated to social media, which includes a fact sheet that spells out some of the legal issues that your organisation should consider when using social media. As a quick summary, when you are considering your obligations around safety of your youth volunteers, you need to understand your obligations under negligence laws, whether you have work health and safety obligations, whether there are any other sources of safety obligations, such as legislation governing the industry that you are in and any contractual requirements, for example, government funding. And just remember the two sides to safety, the duty for the volunteer and the duty to the volunteer. Let's take a closer look now at your duty of care to youth volunteers. All volunteer involving organisations have a duty of care for youth volunteers. That is, to take reasonable steps to avoid reasonably foreseeable harm to youth volunteers and any person that might be affected by your organisation's activities. Note that the standard is not to prevent all incidents or to be perfect. The standard is to take reasonable action to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm. There may be an incident or an accident, but your group took all reasonable action to prevent it. So this will mean it is not liable, or rather legally responsible. So what about youth volunteers? What is interesting about negligence law is that it requires you to take steps because of reasonably foreseeable harm. What is reasonably foreseeable for an adult volunteer might be different to what is reasonably foreseeable for a youth volunteer. Further, the standard of care expected in relation to youth volunteers may be higher than that owed to other volunteers. Let's go back to Mountain Creek and 17-year-old Georgina. If you remember, Mountain Creek is organising a dance party on a Friday night for under 14-year-olds. It has asked some of the older youth members, such as Georgina, as well as some of the parents to help out on the night. Georgina volunteers at time, so she's on the late shift. So her job is to help everyone out of the dance hall, clean it up, along with some of the other parents. Along with all the adults there, Georgina finishes at 11 p.m. She isn't quite sure how she's getting home. There's no public transport. She doesn't have a car or a license, and she doesn't have enough money to catch a taxi or an Uber. Arguably, a reasonable organisation in the position of Mountain Creek would identify that their duty to ensure Georgina's safely getting home is higher than their duty to ensure the adults get home. This is not to say they have no duty of care to the adults, but given Georgina's age, income, and transport options, it is reasonably foreseeable that she might not be able to safely get home, and a reasonable organisation in the same position as Mountain Creek might take steps to ensure that all the young volunteers have a way of getting home. You also need to be aware there may be specific safety standards that apply to children for organisation in some places. And this is an area that we expect to see some changes in. So do keep an eye out for those changes. Currently, only specific child safe standards apply in Victoria. These are set out in our National Guide, Part 3. However, the report of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse has recommended that a set of national standards be applied to all organisations dealing with children. A visual of the 10 recommended standards from the final report is on your screen now. For a moment, these are only recommendations, but we expect at some point that they may become law. If you subscribe to our monthly not-for-profit law update, we will keep you informed of any changes to the law. Meanwhile, it's a good idea to apply best practice in child safety when it comes to looking after your youth volunteers and any children they're working with. Just want to touch now on reporting obligations. There are various mandatory and voluntary reporting schemes in operation around Australia relating to child safety. The reporting schemes are generally dealt with under multiple pieces of legislation in each state and territory. It's easy to see how organisations might only consider their reporting obligations from the perspective of a client using the service. But if your organisation engages youth volunteers, you may also attract the mandatory reporting requirements in your state or territory. Even if you're not legally required to comply, if your organisation interacts with children and young people, that is, through client services or volunteering, we suggest that you use the reporting requirements as a guide for the creation of a child-safe environment and will work towards compliance so that you can be satisfied you are taking all reasonable steps to protect children from risks to their health and safety. As a very high-level summary, mandatory reporting obligations are what the name tells us, mandatory. The legislation in each state and territory lists out mandated reporters, for example, doctors, teachers, and the circumstances that a mandatory report must be made and to whom. For example, sometimes it's a government agency, sometimes it's the police. In most states and territories, these obligations apply to any young person under the age of 18. However, some of the obligations apply only to people 17 or 16. This differs slightly from state to state, but generally speaking, the core of the mandatory reporting obligation is that a mandatory reporter must report if they know or suspect a child is at risk of harm or is experiencing harm. Voluntary reporting obligations are what the name tells us, voluntary. The legislation in each state or territory lists out who can make a voluntary report, but generally speaking, it applies to any person to be able to voluntarily make a report if they believe or know that a child is at risk of harm or is experiencing harm. Reportable conduct schemes. New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT have what is known as reportable conduct schemes. These schemes place specific obligations on the heads of certain organisations to report if they become aware that a child abuse allegation has been made against an employee, director, volunteer or contractor in their organisation. The scheme sits separately but alongside mandatory and voluntary reporting obligations, and they are allegation-based. That is, they are a way for the government to be aware of all allegations that have been made against an individual. Generally speaking, they also capture a broader range of conduct than the mandatory and voluntary reporting schemes do. Not all not-for-profits will be subject to the reportable conduct schemes. We'll cover where to find out more information in the next slide. Finally, irrespective of whether or not the mandatory reporting or reportable conduct scheme applies to you, it is recommended that any organisation that works with children or young people have a procedure for responding to a report of suspected or actual child abuse. For example, consider making it part of your written policies about working with young people that if any adults form a belief that a youth volunteer or employee is in need of protection for whatever reason, they report it to management as soon as possible so a decision can be made about reporting the concerns appropriately and lawfully and protecting that young person. On the screen, we have a list of the primary legislation that deals with obligations in each jurisdiction, along with the relevant body that you can contact for more information about your reporting obligations. So what does this all mean for your organisation? Find out more information. Learn what child protection laws your organisation must comply with. Find out who the relevant child protection body is in your state and territory, and find out what are the best practice standards and implement them. What policies and procedures does your organisation have at the moment? Do they meet the required standard at law and best practice? Ask yourself, are youth volunteers adequately considered and protected under your children's safety policies and procedures? And review and update these policies and procedures. Make sure they are in line with your legal obligations, best practice, and that youth volunteers are considered within them. Make sure all committee members, employees, volunteers, and independent contractors are appropriately inducted and aware of their reporting obligations in the volunteer agreements and employment contracts, in induction and in training. Further information is available on our website, including a link to a child safety toolkit that covers off the law in each state and territory and provides an example of child safe policy and child safe code of conduct. We urge you to consider that toolkit.
Thanks, Nadine. In this section, we're going to consider the different types of screening that you may be required to undertake and the two sides to volunteer screening. That is, screening of the people that work alongside your youth volunteers, such as employees and other volunteers, and screening of the youth volunteer themselves. Let's start with working with children checks, or in some states and territories called working with vulnerable people checks. These checks are regulated differently by each state and territory in Australia. Working with children checks are used in New South Wales, Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria and Western Australia. The requirements differ between each jurisdiction, but essentially they are a check on a person's history to determine their suitability to engage in child-related work. Working with vulnerable people checks are similar to working with children checks and are used in the ACT and Tasmania. They are used to assess a person's suitability to work with vulnerable people in certain regulated activities. Whether or not you have to undertake these checks on your youth volunteers or on the persons engaging with your youth volunteers is a two-step question that will differ slightly in each state and territory. First, you need to ask yourself, Is the youth volunteer or the person engaging with the youth volunteer undertaking child-related work or employment or a regulated activity, or are they in a prescribed position? And second, you need to ask yourself whether or not an exception applies. The question of whether or not a person is undertaking child-related work or regulated activity is quite complex and differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It is really important that you understand whether or not your organisation and each of your personnel are engaging in this type of work, as it can cause problems if you've undertaken a check unnecessarily or if you have failed to do so when you were obligated to. For more information on this topic, we recommend you consult Chapter 5 of our National Guide on Volunteering, and that you contact the regulator in your state or territory to confirm whether or not you should be undertaking these checks on your youth volunteers. For youth volunteers, many jurisdictions exempt people under the age of 18 from having to undertake a check. For example, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Southern Australia. In Tasmania, it is 16, and in Northern Territory, it is 15. There are some exceptions to this, however. For example, in Victoria, the exception does not apply to people under the age of 18 who are supervising children under the age of 15 in employment. For the people that engage with your youth volunteers, such as employees or older volunteers, there is a chance that by working with your youth volunteers, they are engaging in child-related work or a regulated activity. Once again, we strongly recommend that you consult Chapter 5 of our National Guide on Volunteering, and that you contact the regulator in your state or territory to confirm whether or not you should be undertaking these checks. Police checks. A common question that we get here at Not-for-Profit Law is, does a working with children check differ from a police check? The answer is yes. Even if a volunteer or employee is required to undertake a working with children or working with vulnerable persons check, they may still be required to get a police check, sometimes called a national police check, criminal record check, or national criminal history check. These two screening procedures are established for different purposes. Some of the difference between police checks and working with children or working with vulnerable people checks include what is actually checked, what is revealed by the checks, the outcome, the length of validity of the checks, and whether the check is transferable across jurisdictions. Because of the differences between these checks, your organisation may wish to conduct working with children or working with vulnerable people check and police checks, depending upon the nature of the work being conducted by your staff or volunteers. For example, not all criminal offences will be relevant for the working with children check, only those that the department considers to pose a risk to children. Therefore, previous convictions such as traffic offences or thefts may not be considered in a working with children check. A police check allows an organisation to be aware of all reasonable previous convictions, child-related or not, and this may be appropriate if you are seeking an employee or volunteer who, for example, may be handling money or driving clients between locations, or working with your youth volunteers. Your organisation may also be legally obliged to require police checks for certain roles under specific legislation or due to a contractual agreement, for example, a funding agreement. Finally, if you aren't required to undertake a working with children or working with vulnerable person check, and you are engaging youth volunteers, remember that your organisation owes a duty of care to all volunteers to take all reasonable steps to protect them from reasonably foreseeable harm in the workplace. Make sure that those who are supervising or have control over youth volunteers have been adequately screened. Undertaking a police check may be necessary to protect your youth volunteers. And finally, your organisation may not be required by law to undertake working with children, working with vulnerable people, or police checks, but you may decide to run discretionary background checks. There are some other checks that you can take to make sure that you're making an informed decision about a person's suitability to work with young people, such as reference checks and Google searches. Depending on your youth volunteer's role and responsibilities and whether they are engaging with other youth volunteers, particularly youth volunteers younger than them or vulnerable client groups, you may also wish to undertake these searches. One final word of caution before we finish with some top tips is that getting screening right is an important step in protecting your youth volunteers and others in your organisation, but it can also be tricky. It's a balancing act. While finding the right person to fill a vacant role is important, an organisation has an overarching duty to provide a safe environment for staff, volunteers and clients. Good screening procedures when recruiting is a key way for organisations to try and address problems before they arise. This must be a balanced approach, however. Only tests or checks relevant to the position on offer are required, and your organisation should make a considered decision before refusing an applicant. There are legal protections preventing discrimination on the basis of an irrelevant criminal check. See Part 5 of our National Volunteer Guide for more information.
This brings us to the end. As way of summary, 1. Why it is important to distinguish youth volunteers from other types of workers. As we saw from the example with Jessica, who was a member of the Mountain Creek group, because she volunteered, then this meant different laws applied and the organisation's insurance may not have covered her. If Jessica had wanted instead to be a member of the committee, that is the board of Mountain Creek Youth Inc., then the law would not allow it if the organisation were incorporated in New South Wales. The key message here is that organisations need to make sure they understand how youth volunteers differ from other types of volunteers and other people involved with the organisation. 2, how best to engage youth volunteers. Use a volunteer agreement, have a volunteer position description, and induct the volunteer. Make sure the volunteers have adequate supervision. Check if you need consent from a parent or guardian. 3, managing your volunteers. Make sure your organisation has relevant policies and procedures to support youth volunteers. This might include when they volunteer. For example, if a law does not prevent it during school hours, how many hours they can volunteer in a week or a fortnight, if they can volunteer at night. Think back to Georgina, who was a volunteer at the disco until 11 p.m. at night. Remember that all organisations have a legal duty to prevent injury or loss from occurring to those whom they should reasonably foresee may be affected by their activities. The organisation must take reasonable action to prevent foreseeable harm. Again, think back to Georgina and the duty the organisation owed her in relation to getting her home safely. Finally, protect your youth volunteers from both the harm that can be done to them and also the harm they could bring to the organisation. Again, think back to Georgina. She was 17 and was volunteering with 14-year-olds. Was the organisation obliged to get a working with children check for her? What about the organisation's adult volunteers that worked alongside Georgina? Think back to Raj. If he was bullying, this could harm the reputation of the organisation, along with harm caused to the volunteer manager. That manager might take legal action. Possibly, if you had undertaken a reference check for Raj with his before he began volunteering, you might have learnt that he had worked or volunteered for another organisation who'd ended the relationship because he'd allegedly bullied another volunteer there. All very important things to consider. But that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We've covered a lot today. Our National Guide on Volunteering covers a lot of all of these issues in more detail, and we urge you to refer to it.
So on the screen here, you see additional resources. Not-for-Profit Law has developed a National Volunteer Guide which sets out in detail the key legal issues affecting volunteer-involving organisations. This guide is divided into 6 parts and is available on the same page of the website as this webinar. Along with this webinar, Not-for-Profit Law has developed other webinars for volunteer-involving organisations. The volunteering relationship, that is distinguishing between volunteers and other workers in community organisations, and unpaid work, court-ordered volunteering, mutual obligation activities, and other forms of unpaid work. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this webinar.